Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Paige, and my topic of interest was environmental policy. So in this presentation, I'm going to discuss the policy implications of the Flint, Michigan water crisis with a focus on environmental justice. Okay, so this is just a quick introduction to the Flint water crisis in case you might be unfamiliar. So from April 2014 to 2015, nearly 10,000 individuals in Flint, Michigan were exposed to drinking water that contained lead and harmful contaminants like E. coli. So these contaminants brought about several health implications in residents, including rashes, Legionnaire's disease, and burning eyes, which ultimately killed around 10 residents because of the Legionnaire's disease, and thousands of other residents were permanently affected. Also, I do want to note, even though the sources say that the lead exposure lasted from 2014 to 2015, the water crisis impacted the community for much longer than that. It was a really long time until they actually had safe drinking water. Okay, so really quickly, this is the racial makeup of Flint in 2016. As you can see, approximately 57% of the population identified as Black, 37% white, and 6% other. In addition, in 2016, over 42% of the population was living below the poverty line, which is the highest concentrated rate of poverty in Michigan. This is really important when we're considering the issues that the community faced and the long-lasting implications and slow response times that the water crisis would have. So while there are many factors that contributed to the Flint water crisis, my argument is that there were several policies that not only led to the crisis, but also made it worse. So the two policies that I'm focusing on are the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act and the Local Financial Stability and Choice Act, or Public Act 436. So the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act was passed in 1974 with the goal of providing safe drinking water to everyone. Under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, they required that water is treated for corrosion, among other contaminants. However, when Flint switched their water source in 2014 to Lake Huron to Flint River, the city wasn't required by the Environmental Quality Department to treat the new source. So when complaints began to arise from citizens, the city claimed that they were taking anti-corrosive measures, but further evidence would prove that they weren't actually taking any measures at all. Yeah, so under this act, the legally acceptable level of lead in drinking water is 15 parts per billion, but throughout the water crisis, they found over 1,000 parts per billion in some cases in residents' homes. And even with the evidence of contamination, we see another huge failure from the Environmental Protection Agency, as they didn't respond to the crisis until January of 2016. Okay, so there were several implications of the SDWA, not only in Flint, but also in thousands of communities across the globe. A study by the Natural Resources Defense Council in 2019 showed that the Safe Drinking Water Act does not apply equitably across the country. In fact, in low-income and minority communities like Flint, they face greater rates of violations. Sorry. They determined that race is the strongest indicator of slow regulation enforcement, which would explain why a quick response was not present throughout the water crisis. In addition, the study found that when remedied, the problems often persist and are still left uncorrected. Under the Safe Water Drinking Act, regulations are not equally or actively enforced. Even today, the city of Flint has missed several water quality testing deadlines. And in these cases, penalties are minor, if at all present. And the presence of the Safe Water Drinking Act creates slow response times when there actually is an issue. So overall, this creates a huge system of distrust that residents of Flint and environmental justice survivors experience today. The Safe Drinking Water Act creates a false sense of security that makes individuals feel like they're safe, knowing that their water is being tested and that they can be assured that they're not consuming contaminants. So when issues do arise, they often second guess themselves and put their trust into a policy that's meant to protect them. And when the policies fail or they're improperly implemented, residents struggle to believe that the problem is ever truly solved, creating a system of distrust. The Local Financial Stability and Choice Act, more commonly known as Public Act 436, was passed in 2012. The act implements an emergency management law where the government appoints emergency managers to oversee areas deemed to be in financial crisis. The emergency management in Flint is 100% responsible for the water crisis, as it was designed to prioritize decisions that cut costs even at the expense of an entire community. With this, the emergency manager made the executive decision to switch Flint's water source, which was the root of the contamination. Looking at the demographics of Public Act 436, we can see that it's not at all a race-neutral approach. As of 2019, only 10% of the state of Michigan was under emergency management, while 14% of Michigan identifies as African American and 79% identifies as white. Emergency management systems are present in populations that are on average 71% African American and 21% white. In addition, since 2009, over 52% of Michigan African Americans have been under emergency management at some point. So obviously this is not a race neutral approach, and the implication of that is that it denies African Americans and minorities local elected democratic control of their communities. In addition, it disproportionately affects low income and minority communities that are deemed to be in financial crisis. The act grants power to an outside entity that often has no hand in the community, but is making defining decisions for them. In addition, these defining decisions don't actually involve any input or engagement from the community or elected city officials. Therefore, when the water source was switched, the community had no say, although it should have been a collective decision. Finally, the act worsens financial problems. They're designed to cut costs in ways that are not always safe or beneficial to the communities that they're designed for. And they also take funding away from already struggling cities, taking additional financial allocation and assistance off the table and ultimately deepening the lack of resources. Overall, the policy limits the community's ability to respond because of the lack in finances, resources, and their own agency. Okay, so here are some possible solutions. On a governmental level, efficient and equal government response times are important. In this case, it could have prevented the lengthened exposure and the health complications had the government listened and responded efficiently. Abandoning the emergency management system could also be incredibly beneficial, as when decisions are made that affect the well-being of an entire community, they should be made by those citizens and those elected officials, not an outside entity. In addition, non-discriminatory housing policies would be beneficial in responding to crisis. Forms of redlining are still present, which was what allowed white citizens to be able to move out of Flint during the crisis, while minorities had no choice but to stay. For the Safe Drinking Water Act, stronger regulation, enforcement, and fines could be implemented on top of regulations, ensuring equal enforcement regardless of race or financial status. On top of this, many call for accountability and independent assessment of the actions that led to the crisis in Flint. And finally, there has to be environmental justice and an equal distribution of risk amongst society. Okay. So sorry, let me go back. Okay, so some individual actions we can take include education and vigilance. It's important to educate ourselves and others on environmental justice and pollution cases occurring around the world. In addition, we can be activists and we can demand change. And this could include writing to and calling our representatives and elected officials, but it could also include standing with those who don't have a voice. And if you're able to, you can also donate to organizations that make a difference. And I've included some of those here as well. Okay, so here is some relevance in terms of what we've talked about in class. In the movie The Garden, and the case of the Keystone Pipeline, we see a lack of advocacy for underrepresented communities that we also see in Flint. We've talked about the implementation of harmful policies and decisions since the beginning of time, including policies that appear to help but only end up hurting. Julia Whitaker discusses environmental justice and systematic racism, along with the importance of implementing environmental justice into laws and regulations. Even today, it's difficult to prove intentional discrimination, but marginalized communities are still being disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. We've also talked about Native people and how they continue to lack complete access to their own lands, as well as authority over their lives and resources due to policy frameworks. And with this, we talked about the Marshall Trilogy as well. And today we talked about race, class, and gender and how marginalized groups are often forced to live under poor conditions. And we discussed how policies may have changed, but the inequalities they are rooted in still exist today. And we see that in the policies that were implemented in Flint as well. Finally, my takeaways from this presentation are that we have to do better. The Flint water crisis and many other environmental justice cases could have been avoided. Justice issues often result from a negligence of several parties and governmental organizations, and they promote a system of distrust. In terms of hopefully a career in environmental policy, it's clear that public health and social justice should be a central focus. And developing policies that promote equality is essential, and there has to be an equal distribution of risk, even in complex situations. What I've learned from this is that being educated on environmental issues is extremely important if we want to advocate for any type of change. We can really implement what we learn about environmental justice into almost every aspect of our lives in any career that we go into. But ultimately, it's also important to look deeper into the environmental issues to understand the entire scope and the underlying factors that cause them. Okay, wow, I think that's it. Okay, and those are my references. Perfect. Thank you.